The transition from war communism to the new economic policy. The new economic policy was implemented in March 1921, right after the Civil War, at a time when people were in an extremely difficult situation, faced with death, hunger, and devastation. The policy made it possible to restore the country's economy as soon as possible and to improve the population's standard of living. The relevance of the topic lies not only in its historical importance, but also in the importance of researching and analyzing the economic reforms, their features and influence on the history of Kazakhstan.
In March 1921, an important question was raised at the Congress of the Communist Party about the need to replace Protozyorska with an kind tax. This began the transition from the policy of war communism to the NEP. On August 9th of that year, the relevant decree was passed, which laid down the principles for the industry, which had to function under the new economic conditions. Thanks to the decree, excessive centralism was loosened, allowing the industrial sectors to develop more freely. Workers also began to receive material incentives, wages that were directly dependent on their qualification and performance. A very important reform was the transfer of state-owned enterprises to self-sufficiency. This allowed them to solve a number of important issues independently, particularly with regard to raw materials and sales of products. Cooperatives, partnerships, and even private individuals could rent commercial and industrial enterprises in the city. Already in 1922, the Land Code was adopted on 6 October. It gave peasants the right to rent land and use hired labor, although to a limited extent. They could also choose how they wanted to use the land and were free to leave the village community. After a while, the caste system was abolished. A fairly high in-kind tax was imposed on the peasant who lived alone. They could keep only 1.5% of their produce. Overall, the beginning of the transition to the new economic policy had been successfully completed by 1923. The Land Code abolished the right to private ownership of land, and land could be leased on the conditions that it was cultivated by one's own farm. Monetary reform. The hard currency was the chervonets. The chervonets were mainly used for wholesale trade, while retail trade was conducted using treasury bills. In 1921, the state bank began to operate in the country, issuing loans to industry. The quote, chervonets was backed by gold, the content of which corresponded to the pre-revolutionary 10 ruble coin and cost $6 US. Chervonets was backed by our gold and foreign currency. The economic successes during the NEP period. They were evident. The upturn in the national economy was already evident by in 1922. In particular, the problem of food and clothing provision was resolved. The pre-war level in animal husbandry was reached 5 years after the start of the reform in 1927. And in general, the national economy by that time was at the level of pre-revolutionary 1923, and in some indicators, in particular, the consumption of foodstuffs in rural areas was even ahead of it.
However, there were some related problems. In 1923, the so-called sales crisis broke out. The prices of essential goods were too high for the peasants, who in protest began to delay the transfer of grain. The party had to influence the selling prices so that the crisis was overcome. The two grain procurement crises were also related to the disproportionate treatment of the city and the countryside. Their dates were 1925 and 1927-28. They were also resolved by administrative regulation, but dissatisfaction with the new economic policy was still growing. The recognition of the role of the market was combined with measures to abolish it. The official propaganda was critical of the private entrepreneur, and the image of the NEPman as the enemy was shaped in the public consciousness. From the mid-20s, measures to curb the development of the policy were replaced by a policy of its winding up. From a positive side, agriculture began to develop. From the negative, resources were taken from peasants. The new economic policy contributed to economic growth and recovery, and led to the development of market relations and commodity money.